Hello, I'm Linda Chavez, and I'd like to welcome all of you to Leading the Way. We are going to have a discussion today with two experts on the shifting attitudes in America about immigration. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then about our other participants. I am a newly minted senior fellow at the National Immigration Forum, but previously I was the founder of the Becoming American Institute and the director of the Becoming American Initiative. I have served in multiple administrations. I was director of public liaison under President Reagan, also director of the Civil Rights Commission under President Reagan. And I have written a syndicated column for nearly 40 years. So that's my background. My first book was Out of the Barrio Toward a New Politics of Hispanic Assimilation. And boy, does that subhead turn out to be true in terms of this year's election. Joining me today are Robert Jones. Robert is the founder and the CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. He is also the author of a book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robbie has also been a frequent guest on national television programs, has written widely in all major publications. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Also joining me today is Tim Miller. He is a writer at large at the Bulwark, which is one of the leading online publication and has been the source of lots of good information and lots of good stories during this election cycle. Tim has had a variety of roles. He is also the political director of Republican Voters Against Trump. He was a spokesman at the Republican National Committee, and he was also the communications director for Jeb Bush in 2016. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things I want to get right into is what a difference 4 years make. I mean, 2016 was a very different election in terms of the immigration issue. Immigration was very much front and center in that campaign. You could not turn on the TV and see a Trump rally without hearing chants of build the wall, and also the claim, it turned out not to quite turn out as Mr. Trump hoped, that Mexico would pay for that wall. And yet in this election, immigration has not been front and center. And so I'd like to get just an open question here, starting maybe with you, Tim, because you've been so involved in covering the election. What do you imagine the difference is and why immigration has not been so much the issue that the Trump administration and Trump, the candidate, pushed this year?
To be honest, I don't think that either campaign saw immigration as a particularly winning issue for them. And so I think it was candidate driven. I think in 2016, the president, the then candidate Trump, obviously saw this as a big wedge issue, as the thing that was going to carry him with his white working class base. It was the thing I think was one of the issues, one of the main issues that they thought attracted the working class white Obama Trump voters that carried him to the election in 2016. Fast forward 4 years, the president's deep unpopularity, throughout the country actually resulted in, almost historic highs for views about immigration across the board. And so I think that he felt like maybe that he got what he could get as far as using immigration as a wedge issue. He didn't have a great story to tell on it. The wall wasn't built. Mexico didn't pay for it. So there wasn't a good retroactive story. It wasn't that useful proactively. Meanwhile, I think the Democrats are a little bit snake bitten on the issue and didn't see didn't see a lot to be gained by focusing on it. I think that there was some thematic big picture focus on kind of Trump's un-American behavior that did help Democrats, was part of the mix that helped Democrats get and Joe Biden do well, particularly in the suburbs and exurbs with college-educated white voters. But they, I think, were concerned about overplaying that hand and losing even more ground with white working class voters. I think that if you look back, what you would notice is, I think if you look back, maybe in retrospect, the Democrats shouldn't have, could have used it to more effect with Hispanic voters. I know we'll get into that a little more.
Yeah, Robbie, let me turn to you, because I think what Tim has described is basically a shift in the landscape. It worked in 2016. It certainly fed into the cultural anxiety in a certain segment of the white working class population, many of whom may have felt threatened by competition from immigrant workers taking jobs where they had established their own stronghold and suddenly having to compete with newcomers. But can you talk a little bit more about the shifting attitudes? Because your organization does absolutely fabulous polling on this. And I'd like to get a little more perspective on how the attitude shifted over the course of the last 4 years on immigration in particular.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's right. I think the thing 4 years ago, that we saw was, this "Make America Great Again" thing was linked to this endless rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, in the campaign. And, I think that the appeal, and it wasn't just to white working class voters, but to bring a religious lens here, it was to some of the stalwart white evangelical Protestant voters as well. This was a great appeal for them. And what was behind that appeal? It was less about economic anxiety and more about cultural anxiety, the kind of sense of the changing demographics in the country, a sense that what we're seeing is that white Christians in the country are shrinking as a proportion of the population. White evangelicals, for example, have gone from being 21% of the country down to 15% of the country just between 2008 and today. And so I think Trump was sort of seizing on this sense of a changing complexion of the country, right? Demographically speaking, religiously speaking, and that immigration was seen to be a kind of external threat to a preservation of really a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. So I think that was the lay of the land in 2016. There's a through line here, though, that I think shouldn't be lost. So this threat, right, to demographic and cultural change is still there. But I think what happened in 2020 is, whereas immigrants were cast in the role of the threat, African Americans were cast in the role of the threat in 2020, right? So we just kind of had a swapping out of immigrants as the threat to African Americans as the threat. And I think this fits with kind of Trump's opportunism. Really, and it has a good instinct, I think, for opportunism. And what was really happening, of course, in the home stretch of the election wasn't about immigration. It was about George Floyd and policing and systemic racism in the country. And so he kind of just rejiggered, his anti-immigrant rhetoric to kind of fit the kind of anti-Black and started talking about threats to the suburbs. Right, by low-income housing and African Americans, we're going to make the suburbs dangerous. Was his threat, in the same way that he talked about immigrants being rapists and murderers, right, in the opening of his campaign in 2016. So I started sort of like he's slotting in a different villain, into the same rhetoric. It did have an effect, though, in terms of the numbers. And what we see is that, particularly among Republicans, when we ask people whether immigration, for example, was a critical issue in the country, Republicans are 22 points less likely in this election cycle to say that immigration was a critical issue compared to 2016. So they took their cues, I think, from the president. Now, what did they put in its place? Crime, right, was the thing that rose to its place. And again, in fitting. So what's crime about? It is this language of threats of African Americans and low-income housing. So it took kind of one othering and replaced it with another one. But it did mean that there was less attention on immigration. And we did see some attitudes shifting. there. And I can talk about the actual on a few specific policies in a bit. I don't want to take up too much airtime on the front end, but it is worth noting there's clearly a path forward. I'll put up a little placeholder, and there's a path forward, I think, for a Biden administration that actually is bipartisan and cross-religious here.
Tim, looking at the electorate in this cycle, one of the things that we're seeing out of some of the exit polling is a larger than expected Hispanic vote for Trump. Now, this did not surprise me. In fact, I wrote a piece about it in the New York Times some 6 weeks or so ago, warning that this was likely to happen. I don't know that it says anything more than Hispanics as a group. First of all, they're not really a group. There are many different groups, and depending on which group you're talking about, if you're talking about Mexican Americans, for example, many of them have followed the path of previous immigrant groups, and that is they move up the economic ladder into the middle class, begin to identify much more with the majority population. I wanted to ask you, though, Tim, whether or not you think that some of the really aggressive anti-immigrant moves of this administration may have had an impact with another group of voters, and that is suburban women, seeing children locked in cages, learning at the end of the campaign that 545 children have been orphaned by this administration. The administration separated them from their parents and then lost track of where those parents were after they deported them. Do you think that had any impact? How do you see the larger population in its response to the immigration policies and some of the individual acts, and how did that play out? I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no doubt. I think that I think that there was an effect on both sides of that equation, for sure. I'm a little bit skeptical at this early stage to put all our weight in the exit poll data, given what we saw with the polls coming in, and in general, the early exit polls, aren't as reliable as what happens later when you match against the vote. That said, you can just look at communities. And look at the vote total from communities and just put the exit polls to the side. And what you see is in predominantly Hispanic communities, not just the Cuban community in Florida, but in Puerto Rican neighborhood precincts, along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, in Hispanic precincts in Houston. You saw Donald Trump gain a lot from 2016. I think that some of that is what you laid out, Linda. I'd love to hear more from you on that, since you've been looking at this much longer than me. Another part of it, though, I think is that race and demographics are starting to get subsumed by the education gap between the parties right now, and you're seeing a much across racial lines, the education and gender gaps both. So across racial lines, what you're seeing is men who don't have a college degree being trending more towards Republicans, whereas now on the other side, the folks you're talking about, women with a college degree, trending more towards Democrats. I think that immigration is part of that picture. I think, as Robbie said, crime is part of the picture. It's also, this is a global trend that's happening in Europe and in places that don't have our same issue matrices really that they're dealing with at all. It's just kind of the nature of the trends across, how conservative parties are trending versus how, sort of left and center left parties are trending. So, I think that we can dig more into exactly why that happened with Hispanic communities. I think as far as in the suburbs are concerned, there's absolutely no doubt that the president's language around immigration, that his actions around immigration at the border, having a white supremacist collaborator in Stephen Miller running the immigration regime, what we saw at airports, all of that stuff built over time. We can't throw away 2018, the backlash against the caravan rhetoric, helped in the suburbs. So I think absolutely, you're seeing this backlash, particularly among college-educated women, but also men in suburban and exurban communities around major cities.
One of the things that I know many conservatives talked about and have always talked about in terms of immigration is we're fine with immigration. We just want it to be legal immigration. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we saw during the 4 years of the Trump administration is that their focus was not just on cutting illegal immigration. Ironically, the Trump administration started off at a time when illegal immigration to the United States was a many decades old low, and it's actually increased during the Trump administration. But what this administration did that was quite unusual and really did break with the norms was to go after legal immigration, to cut in half the number of legal immigrants who were admitted, to go after special visa programs for workers, to go after the refugee program, essentially destroying a program that has had bipartisan support going back to its initial start in 1980. And so I'm wondering, Robbie, whether you can talk a little bit about whether or not this anti-legal immigration, anti-immigrant really, rather than focusing on illegality or legality, just making immigrants somehow less worthy of being Americans. What effect did that have in changing attitudes and in the polling you've done?
I think this is really right on the nose here. One of the things that I think President Trump has succeeded in doing is really scrambling these distinctions that we used to make, right, between illegal immigration and legal immigration, between legal immigration and refugee programs, right? And that basically what has happened is his rhetoric has cast them all in the same bucket. And I think you're right to kind of call out Stephen Miller here as kind of working in the background, so that it's really admitting no one, right? So it's whether it's refugees, whether it's legal certain visa programs, it really is reducing all of it. And there's been some support for that. I mean, I think notably, particularly again among white evangelicals, you can see there is support about 6 in 10 preventing refugees from entering the U.S. And that's from a group that has major refugee resettlement programs that many evangelical organizations and Catholic organizations run. But I think it's been one of the casualties is kind of just what the big distinction we see in the polling really is that anything that has to do with keeping people out has gotten stronger support from Republicans and white evangelical Protestants in particular. But it hasn't. The one thing I would say that's maybe hopeful here is that it hasn't really impacted the attitudes on what to do about people who are already here. So there's a real distinction now between those two things, where there hasn't been much movement here. There has been some people taking their cues from the president on external things. But for example, just throw one out on this question that no one's talked about for quite some time, but on a kind of comprehensive approach to dealing with people who are here in the country currently illegally, about 11 million people. There has been, we've been asking this question since 2011. There has always been more than 6 in 10 Americans, and we probably asked this question well over 100 times. There's always been more than 6 in 10, closer to 2/3 support for allowing a path to citizenship for those who are in the country illegally as the preferred pathway, as a preferred policy solution. For what we do here. That includes, in fact, half of Republicans and a majority of white evangelicals, again, who tend to be more anti-immigrant in their attitude. So, despite the fact there is this kind of huge partisan chasm on the wall, on the travel ban for Muslim majority countries, on refugees, there's big partisan divides. There's really not on things like Dreamers and what to do about people who are in the country right now.
Well, we spent a lot of time dissecting what happened and some of the reasons it happened. But the whole point of this gathering is to try to find a path forward. And so let me pose a couple of questions to you, Tim and Robbie, as well. Since Robbie suggested that at least among conservatives, among white evangelicals, et cetera, there is an opening to move forward on dealing with solving the problems of those who are here legally. Tim, I'm sure you remember that during the Bush administration, the last time there was a real possibility of a comprehensive immigration reform package, President Bush at that time wanted to make a focus on essentially creating a pathway to citizenship for those present. And that was the big stumbling block. Conservatives did not want that. They opposed that. And it's one of the reasons that that immigration bill did not go through. Do you think, looking at the makeup of the new Congress, looking at the fact that you do have at least a majority support for doing something about the people who are already here, and especially the population of immigrants who came here as children, through, this was not their own choice. Some of them were actually babes in arms. Do you see this as the first priority to try to build a coalition around solving the existing problem?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit of a rain cloud on this item. I think that a lot of almost all of the Republican elected officials are still spooked by Donald Trump's success, to be honest. I think that the ones who might be likely to be persuadable on issues like this, again, this is talking about elected officials, not the voters themselves. The ones who are likely to be persuaded, the ones who in a different era might have signed on to a deal such as this, I think that they don't even know their own base right now, and they don't understand, how this happened, and their North Star is, I know that my voters like the president, or the former president, as it's about to be, and so I don't want to do anything that alienates them. And so jumping on board with the Democrats on a deal on immigration is going to be something that alienates them, even if it looks popular in the numbers. So I think that is an area of concern. I think that I agree with Robbie. If you look at the actual voter data, I think that there is room for movement, and slowly but surely bringing both religious voters and Republican voters on board for narrow, kind of immigration solutions, particularly dealing with people here. Obviously, the Dreamers is an overwhelmingly popular position that it's sort of mind-boggling that it just hasn't been resolved, given how broadly popular it is. But I think that you're going to deal with a lot of scared Republicans, and I think that while the good news is, in the Trump era, if you look at the data, that loathing of Donald Trump unified the Democrats, who were not always unified, right, on immigration policy. It largely unified the Democrats on this issue and made the numbers look better in polls if you look at the broader electorate. That's also unified the Republicans, who are still going to have the Senate almost certainly, and I think it's tough to see who is going to want to play ball on this.
Let me just follow up on that and maybe push back a little bit. One of the things that I think we're not going to know for a while is why people did vote for Donald Trump. It is hard to believe that 70 million, maybe 71 million, whenever all is said and done, people voted because they liked Donald Trump. They liked his behavior. They approved of his behavior. There were at least a portion of voters who simply liked his policies and felt that his policies trumped, if you'll pardon the pun, some of his bad behavior. So, how this plays out, I don't think we're going to know for a little while. I do think, Tim, you're right, listening to voices like Lindsey Graham and others who have rushed to the president's defense or taking up, the call that this was a stolen election is not encouraging. On the other hand, it's going to be late January before the transition actually occurs, and there will be some time to step back. So at least from my point of view, I may be a little bit more hopeful than you. But Robbie, let me turn to you on this question and ask you in terms of values that those of us in the pro-immigrant community can focus on. How is it we craft a message to reach those people who may be gettable on immigration issues? What are the thematic things that you found out in terms of your polling data that may be persuadable?
I think the things that we see haven't really changed that much. I mean, we have seen, I think that the underlying values, and we've heard this from focus groups and also from the polling, are really, I think, around compassion as something that and really thinking, people thinking about why people are coming here. So something, I think it's why the family separations policy was so unpopular, right? Is that it was harsh, it was punitive, and deliberately so. The value of keeping families together is actually quite a solid value that has kind of cross-party support. And then I think the last thing I think we often forget about, but is pragmatism. That for example, like the idea of deporting 11 million people, when you really start taking that seriously, I think runs out of runway very quickly. And we heard this even among conservative voters in focus groups who called something like that, the largest government program we've maybe ever put together, if we were going to really attempt to put something like that together. And from conservative principles didn't, support that. But I think that kind of pragmatism, compassion, and just really and this sense of keeping families together. I mean, it's 3/4 of Americans who oppose family separations. Majorities are Republicans, majorities of white evangelicals, even the folks who are kind of most on board with the wall and other things. None of them support a policy like that, and it's now, I think I saw some reporting today. It's over 600 kids now that they think this is affected, and I think exactly for those people who are on the fence is like, look, even if I'm really concerned about high levels of immigration and I'm sympathetic to those kinds of arguments, I don't want a country that's stripping kids from their families. That's not the America that I believe in.
Let me ask another question, which is whether or not there are things on the left that could also upset the balance in terms of trying to reach some reasonable accord on immigration and some reasonable immigration reform. Tim, do you see the AOC wing of the Democratic Party pushing perhaps too hard on some issues and that throwing the debate off balance? What is your take?
Yeah, I mean, look, just putting on my political analyst hat, it's hard to say no. I mean, I'm like as about as far progressive as you can get for a Republican / former Republican on this issue. So, this is not like really speaking for me per se, but just as a political issue, decriminalizing border crossings, some of the stuff that Julian Castro was pushing for in the primary debates, just didn't make a lot of sense to me, in the context of an election. It's different now from an advocate standpoint, trying to move the Overton window. I get all that. But from a candidate standpoint, again, we were talking earlier, Dreamers, family separations, these are 80+% issues. Decriminalizing border crossings is, like an 18% issue, so you gotta, be smart about this. And so I do think that was a problem in the primary. I'm concerned that certain segments of the left will look at what happened with the Hispanic vote and say that the way to get all those voters back is to go with some very extreme progressive views on immigration and to focus only on immigration. And I'm pretty skeptical that the voters that were lost to Donald Trump this time were lost because they didn't think that the Democrats, were liberal enough on their immigration policies. So that's another concern I have going forward. I think the Democrats need to think about more of an economic and cultural message for those voters. The last thing I said, you didn't ask this, but I do just, I've been a little bit of a rain cloud. So I do want to say one positive thing I can bring up, and one hopeful thing I think that this group can focus on is there's a lot of administrative stuff that Joe Biden can do. And I think it's really important that there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to focus on this issue for an administrative standpoint, because as incompetent as the Trump administration was almost across the board, immigration was one thing they did actually care about. They were still pretty incompetent in executing some of the stuff. You look at the travel ban, but they were persistent. And so, there were a lot of rulemaking changes that were made, and the wheels of government can turn slowly. And so if you get a Biden administration in there that's, they'll obviously COVID and climate, they have a lot of priorities. I think pressuring them to make sure that they're rolling back and rolling forward both some of these immigration rulemaking decisions that don't matter to Congress, that aren't politically toxic, like some of the things that I was mentioning that the left was pushing during the primary. I think that's a way for tangible progress from the left over the next 2 to 4 years.
On that subject, the refugee program is one in which Congress authorizes a certain ceiling, and then the administration puts forth the number of refugees that are going to be admitted under that ceiling. And basically, Donald Trump is going forward for this coming year has basically halted the program. He's going to allow a few thousand refugees in. Robbie, is that something where a Biden administration coming in can obviously revise that number? It's not, set in stone. They can go back to Congress and give a number that's much more suitable. In terms of your data and polling, is that a good place to start? What do you see as a pathway in terms of the issues that do get that kind of 80% support that a new administration could take on?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the word normalizing comes to mind here, that I think there's a lot of things the Biden administration can do right off the bat to just normalize our immigration policy, right? And kind of pull it back from the more extreme positions that Stephen Miller and the Trump administration have taken us to. And I think refugees, is exactly one place you could do that. We've got in our latest polling, 62% of the country opposing passing laws to prevent refugees from entering the U.S. So I think they're more open, certainly more open to that. The other thing I'd say about the Latino community, just one quick note on that, is that the thing that we've seen in survey after survey after survey is that the thing that outpaces concerns about immigration in the Latino community are always healthcare and education and jobs, right? And just kind of remembering that this is like a fundamental issue, like it. Both healthcare and education jobs are actually 20 points rated more critical than immigration by Latinos in the country. So I think it's worth remembering that it's not just about immigration; it's about healthcare, it's about jobs and education. Is something like vital to remember for outreach to the Latino community.
Robbie, I'm glad you said that, because when I look at that South Texas vote, I look at a lot of small business people in the Mexican American community who were very hard hit by the pandemic, but they lost jobs. I mean, they lost a lot of family members, a lot of lives were lost, but the sense of the ability to reopen, they, I think, gravitated more towards the president, because they had been doing better economically, and they hoped that if the pandemic finally comes under control, that he would have been better for them economically. We've got about 2 minutes left. Let me just throw it to Tim for a minute. If anything you think you might like to add.
Well, look, I think that the opportunity here for the Biden administration is that the Republicans gave Biden the ability to campaign on a lot of themes that were traditionally, Republicans. A lot of things about our country being a shining city on a hill, the greatness of our country, how welcoming how we're a special nation. These weren't obviously exclusively Republican themes, but they were things that Reagan and Dole and Bush leaned on so heavily, and because of Trump, Biden was given the opportunity to sort of take those themes back. I think it helped him politically. So I really do hope that the actions will follow that in the first year or two, and that he'll continue to lean on that, because I think that's a win-win for him, both politically and obviously policy-wise with our country. So particularly on the issues of refugees and asylees and things of that nature. And so I think that is the biggest area for potential progress that Biden is uniquely suited in either party, I think, to take advantage of. And I hope that's something that we see in the next year or two, and hope to be part of that with you all and with people watching.
Robbie?
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I mean, I think that that's dead on. That, again, these values, right? Compassion, pragmatism, keeping families together, like these kinds of values, I think are things that have always been the things that really underpinned really a kind of consensus center on immigration policy. And I think that's right. That kind of thinking about an immigration policy that is guided by the better angels of our nature and not by our worst fears is something that I think a Biden administration is really well positioned to step into, and I think can find at least in the general population among voters a real consensus. And the question is whether the elected officials, Republican elected officials, are going to look more to their voters or more to Trump in terms of where they stand.
Well, I want to thank both of you for a stimulating discussion. And I'm very glad that we left on an optimistic note, because I think there is a path forward. And I know that the National Immigration Forum is going to be helping lead that way. So thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, thank you.